Hey there, I've got a unique story for you. After watching it, let me know in the comments below what do you think.
The first time Margaret Whitmore looked at me like I was something she'd scraped off her Italian leather pump, I was holding a bouquet of sunflowers on her doorstep. Well, she said, her hand still on the brass doorknob of her Park Avenue brownstone, aren't you colorful? That was 3 years ago. 3 years of tight smiles across Thanksgiving tables. 3 years of backhanded compliments about my cute little job. 3 years of her telling anyone who would listen that I was a phase her son was going through. I was never a phase. I was the woman who loved her son. But love, I'd learned, didn't impress Margaret Whitmore. Only money impressed Margaret Whitmore. Specifically, old money. The kind that didn't come from working 12-hour shifts in a kitchen that hit 110 degrees. The kind I didn't have. Not that she knew what I actually had, or who I actually was. That Tuesday night, the night everything changed, started like every other disaster in my life, with an invitation I should have declined. Mother wants us at the flagship, Derek said, shrugging into his charcoal blazer. He didn't look at me when he said it. He'd stopped looking at me directly about 2 weeks ago, right around the time he'd started taking his mother's calls in the other room. The flagship meant Whitmore's on Fifth, the crown jewel of Margaret's restaurant empire. 12 locations across Manhattan and Brooklyn, each one a temple of overpriced mediocrity disguised as elevated American comfort. I'd eaten at 4 of them. The food was fine, competent. The kind of cooking that came from recipes written by consultants and executed by kids straight out of culinary school who were too terrified of Margaret to season properly. I knew that terror. I'd seen it in the eyes of the sous chef at the Brooklyn location when Margaret sent back a perfectly cooked ribeye 3 times, each time for a different imaginary flaw. She's doing her monthly inspection, Derek continued, checking his reflection in the hallway mirror. Wants the family there. You know how she is. I knew exactly how she was. I also knew something Derek didn't. Something I'd known for 6 months but hadn't said out loud yet. Something I'd found in a file on his laptop when he'd asked me to just print something real quick. And I'd seen a spreadsheet labeled WM adjustments. But that was a problem for later. Tonight, I told myself, I would be polite. I would wear the dress she'd approved of, the navy sheath that cost more than my first car. I would smile. I would not mention that I'd spent 5 years working under Daniel Boulud before I'd burned out and walked away from kitchens forever. I would not mention the Michelin star. I would be, in Margaret's preferred terminology, presentable. Whitmore's on Fifth occupied a converted bank building from the 1920s, all marble columns and vaulted ceilings that swallowed sound and made every conversation feel like a church sermon. Margaret had spent a fortune preserving the architectural details. The teller cages became private dining nooks. The vault door became a wine cellar entrance. The original brass fixtures polished until they blinded you if the light hit them right. She'd spent considerably less on the food. Derek's hand found the small of my back as we crossed the dining room, a gesture that looked affectionate to anyone watching but felt like steering. He guided me toward the round table in the center, the one under the massive crystal chandelier, the one where Margaret held court like a queen who'd never been told no. She was already seated, of course, surrounded by her inner circle. There was Patricia, her sister, who laughed at all of Margaret's jokes 2 seconds too early. There was Richard, her lawyer, who'd been trying to get into her will since her husband died. There was Derek's cousin Amanda, who worked as the regional manager and spent most of her time agreeing with whatever Margaret said. And there was me, Elena Voss, the interloper, the waitress, the gold digger. I heard the last one whispered by Patricia as we approached, just loud enough to carry, just quiet enough to be deniable. Margaret's lips twitched. Not quite a smile. More like a cat watching a bird walk into a cage. Elena, she said, not standing. How lovely. I wasn't sure you'd come. I know how you feel about formal dining. Translation: I know you feel out of place here because you don't belong. Thank you for having me, Margaret, I said, sliding into the chair Derek pulled out. I kept my voice warm, my posture relaxed. I'd learned a long time ago that the best defense against women like Margaret was to give them nothing to react to. No flinching, no defensiveness. Just calm, steady presence that made their barbs bounce off like rain on stone. Derek sat between us, a buffer that felt increasingly like a wall. The first course arrived without menus. Margaret had pre-selected everything naturally. A seasonal vegetable terrine that looked like something from a 1990s catering hall, all geometric precision and zero flavor. I took one bite and set down my fork. "Not hungry, dear?" Margaret asked, her own fork moving with mechanical precision. She never enjoyed food. She consumed it, the way she consumed everything, as fuel for performance. "It's lovely," I lied. "Of course it is. Chef Anton prepared it personally." She said personally, the way some people said miraculously, as if the chef's physical presence in the kitchen was a blessing from above rather than his actual job. I knew Chef Anton. Or rather, I knew his type. Culinary school top of his class, full of ambition and technique, ground down by Margaret's obsession with cost percentages and Instagram aesthetics, until he was just another pair of hands executing someone else's vision. I'd seen his resume on LinkedIn 6 months ago. He'd lasted 18 months at Whitmore's. That was practically a record. The wine was poured, something oaky and overpriced that Margaret pronounced with a fake French accent. I let mine sit. I wanted a clear head tonight. "So," Margaret said, setting down her glass with a deliberate chime of crystal. "Derek tells me you've been looking at apartments. In the village." The table went quiet. This was the game. The public interrogation disguised as conversation. "We've been talking about it," I said carefully. Derek and I had been talking about it, actually. Or rather, I'd been talking and he'd been nodding while checking his phone. "I love the neighborhood." "Do you?" Margaret's eyebrows arched. "I wouldn't have thought it was your style. So eclectic." Translation: poor. "I like the energy," I said. "The restaurants." "Ah, yes. The restaurants." She smiled now, and it was worse than her frown. "I suppose you would know about those? From your previous employment." She always said previous employment, like it was a disease I'd recovered from. "I learned a lot," I said. "I imagine you did." She leaned forward, her diamonds catching the chandelier light and throwing prisms across the white tablecloth. "Tell me, Elena, do you ever miss it? The kitchen life?" The pause before kitchen life was deliberate. The slight wrinkle of her nose was deliberate. Everything about Margaret Whitmore was deliberate, calculated, weaponized. "Sometimes," I admitted, "it was hard work. Good work." "Hard work," she repeated, tasting the words like they were foreign. "Yes, I'm sure it was. Standing on your feet all day, taking orders, carrying plates." She turned to Richard with a conspiratorial smile. "Can you imagine, Richard, our Elena, carrying plates?" Richard chuckled on cue. Patricia snorted into her wine. I felt Derek's hand find mine under the table. A squeeze. Not supportive. Warning. "I managed," I said. "I'm sure you did. I'm sure you were very—" She searched for the word, letting the silence stretch. "Capable." The second course arrived, pan-seared salmon with a lemon beurre blanc that had clearly been held too long and broken, the butter separating into oily pools around the plate. I didn't touch it. Margaret watched me not eat. "You know," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant she was about to perform her favorite trick, public humiliation dressed as maternal concern. "I've been thinking about you, Elena. About your situation." "My situation?" "Your circumstances." She waved her hand vaguely, encompassing my dress, my apartment, my entire life. "Derek tells me you're not working right now, that you're between opportunities." Between opportunities. I'd left my last job, consulting for a restaurant group in Chicago, because Derek had asked me to move back to New York with him. Because he'd promised we were building a life together. Because I'd believed him. I've been taking some time, I said, exploring options. How lovely for you. Margaret's smile sharpened. To have that luxury, to not need to work, to be supported. The table had gone very quiet. Even Patricia stopped her nervous laughter. Amanda was staring at her plate like it might contain answers. I don't think that's quite, Derek started. Let me finish, darling. Margaret didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on me, bright and hard and hungry. I was speaking with Barbara Chen last week. You know Barbara. She owns the building on 72nd? And she was telling me about her nephew. Charming boy. Family money, of course. Old family. And he married this girl. This absolutely lovely girl from Connecticut. And do you know what happened? I knew I wasn't supposed to answer. This was a monologue, not a conversation. 6 months later, she cleaned out his accounts and disappeared. Just gone. With his mother's pearls and his grandmother's ring. Margaret shook her head. A performance of tragedy. Barbara said the girl had been a waitress. Can you imagine? A waitress. Serving their family for months, learning their habits, their schedules. And then she took everything. That's terrible, I said, because I had to say something. Isn't it? Margaret reached for her wine, her hand steady, her eyes never leaving mine. But you see, that's the risk. When people marry above their station, when they see an opportunity and they take it. Not for love, not for companionship. She leaned closer, and her voice dropped to a stage whisper that carried perfectly across the silent table. For the money, for the status, for the life they could never build themselves. The chandelier hummed. Someone at another table laughed, oblivious. Mother, Derek said, his voice tight. I don't think this is... Let me speak, Derek. I'm concerned. As a mother, I'm concerned. She placed her hand over mine on the tablecloth. Her skin was cold, dry, the fingers heavy with rings that had never known work. Elena, dear, I hope you understand that I'm saying this from a place of love, of protection, for my son. I looked at her hand on mine, at the perfect manicure, at the emerald that had probably cost more than the annual salary of every cook in her kitchen combined. I understand, I said. I knew you would. She squeezed my fingers, a parody of affection. Because you're a smart girl. You know what you are. You know what you bring to this arrangement. And I want you to know that I see you. I see exactly what you're doing. The silence was absolute now. Even the background music seemed to fade, leaving just Margaret's voice and the ringing in my ears. You're not the first, you know. Derek has had phases before. Girls who thought they could trade their looks for our name, their availability for our security. She laughed, a bright, brittle sound. But they always leave. Eventually. When they realize that this family, my family, is built on something they can never understand. Work. Sacrifice. Generations of building something real. Not. She gestured at me, at my dress, at my face. Not this. Not whatever this is. She sat back, finally releasing my hand. Her smile was radiant, victorious. She'd drawn blood in front of witnesses, and she was basking in it. So, she said, picking up her fork again, the performance complete. Tell me about your day, Elena. I'm sure it was simply fascinating. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just looked at her, really looked at her, past the diamonds and the posture and the performance, to the small, terrified woman underneath who'd married into money young and spent 40 years proving she deserved it. Then I looked at Derek. At his carefully neutral expression, his eyes fixed on his plate, his jaw tight with the effort of not intervening. My husband. The man who'd promised to love me. The man who'd watched his mother call me a gold digger in front of his entire family and said nothing. I stood up. My chair scraped against the marble floor, loud in the sudden silence. Thank you for dinner, Margaret, I said. My voice was calm, steady, the voice I used in kitchens when everything was burning and I needed people to listen. It was illuminating. I didn't look at Derek. I didn't look at anyone. I just walked out of the restaurant, past the teller cages and the vault door and the brass fixtures catching the light, and into the October night. He didn't follow me. I didn't go home. I couldn't face the apartment yet. The life we'd been trying to build, the lie I'd been living for 3 years. Instead, I walked. Down Fifth, past the closed shops and the late-night dog walkers, past the doormen in their brass-buttoned coats who looked through me like I was invisible. I was invisible. That was the point, wasn't it? I'd made myself small for Derek. I'd hidden my past, my credentials, my fire. I'd let Margaret diminish me because I thought that was what love required. Compromise, patience, swallowing your pride until you choked on it. I'd choked enough. My phone buzzed in my clutch. Derek. I ignored it. Then a text. Mother didn't mean it that way. She's protective. You know how she is. I knew exactly how she was. The question was how long Derek had known, and what he'd been willing to sacrifice to keep her happy. I walked until I hit the village, until the buildings got shorter and the streets got narrower, and the energy changed from money to art to something real. I stopped at a bodega for coffee, standing at the counter while the old man behind the register watched me with kind, tired eyes. Bad night? He asked. The worst, I said. Man? Mother-in-law. He laughed, a warm, knowing sound. Worse. Men you can leave. Mothers-in-law follow you. I smiled despite myself. I'm starting to think I should leave both. He nodded, pouring my coffee with steady hands. My wife, God rest her, she had a saying. Don't let someone rent space in your head if they're not paying the rent. Smart woman. She sounds like it. She was. He slid the coffee across the counter. You look like a woman who's been paying someone else's rent for too long. I took the coffee. I didn't answer. But I thought about his words all the way home. Derek wasn't there when I got in. He texted at 2 a.m., staying at Mother's. We should talk tomorrow. We didn't talk the next day. Or the day after. He moved into the guest room, then stopped coming home entirely. The apartment became a museum of our failed marriage, every object a reminder of promises that hadn't survived one dinner. I didn't cry. I'd done enough crying in kitchens, enough crying in walk-in refrigerators where no one could hear you, enough crying in parking lots after 16-hour shifts. Crying was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. Instead, I worked. I pulled out my laptop. I opened files I hadn't touched in years. I made calls to people I hadn't spoken to since I'd left Chicago, since I'd convinced myself that love meant giving up the thing that made me me. And I looked at the WM adjustments spreadsheet again. It was worse than I'd thought. Worse than I'd let myself believe when I'd first found it. Derek hadn't just been helping his mother with accounting efficiencies. He'd been systematically siphoning money from the restaurant accounts, small amounts at first, then larger ones, always coded as consulting fees, or supplier adjustments, or marketing expenses. Over 3 years, nearly $400,000 had disappeared into a shell company Derek controlled. He'd been stealing from his own mother. And he'd been using me as cover. My unemployment gave him plausible deniability, a reason to be at the restaurants, to access the books, to help out, while Margaret focused on expansion. I wasn't just a gold digger in Margaret's eyes. I was the perfect patsy. I sat with that knowledge for 3 days. I could have confronted him. I could have gone to Margaret, shown her the evidence, watched her world collapse. I could have walked away, filed for divorce, started over somewhere new. Instead, I made a plan. The first person I called was Marco Reyes. Elena Voss, he said when he answered, his voice warm with genuine surprise. I thought you'd died. Or worse, gotten a real job. Very funny, Marco. I'm serious. Last I heard, you were playing housewife in New York. I figured you'd forgotten how to hold a knife. I never forget how to hold a knife, Marco. I just choose when to use it. He went quiet. Marco had known me for 15 years, since we'd been line cooks together in San Francisco, since we'd burned and cut and cursed our way through kitchens that chewed up ambition and spit out broken dreams. He knew my voice. He knew that tone. Who do I need to kill? He asked. Nobody. Yet. I need information. On? Whitmore Restaurant Group. 12 locations, Manhattan and Brooklyn. Owner Margaret Whitmore. I need everything. Financials, debt structure, supplier contracts, lease agreements, everything. That's specific and possibly illegal. Everything that's publicly available, I amended, and everything that's not publicly available but might be known to someone in the industry, someone who hears things. Marco was quiet for a moment. This is personal. Very. The husband? Soon-to-be ex-husband, and his mother. Ah. A long pause. The mother-in-law. The worst enemy. Worse than a health inspector with a grudge. Much worse. I'll make some calls. But Elena, are you sure about this? I remember what the kitchen did to you. What it took. You walked away for a reason. I walked away because I thought I had to. I said. I was wrong. I spent the next month building my foundation. I reactivated old contacts, met with suppliers I'd known from my Michelin days, sat in coffee shops with bookkeepers who remembered me from pop-ups and charity events. I was careful, methodical. I didn't rush. Marco's information came in pieces. Whitmore's was leveraged to the hilt. Margaret's expansion into Brooklyn had been funded by a predatory loan from a private equity firm, the kind that charged 18% interest and included performance clauses that were basically traps. She'd missed 3 quarterly targets. She was one default away from losing everything. The restaurants were bleeding money, not because of the food, though the food was mediocre, but because of the structure. Margaret had built an empire on debt and image, on Instagram followers and brand partnerships that cost more than they earned. She was paying $30,000 a month for a PR firm that specialized in luxury lifestyle positioning. She was leasing kitchen equipment at rates that would have made a loan shark blush. She'd signed a 5-year contract with a food distributor who charged 40% above market rate in exchange for exclusivity benefits that didn't exist. And Derek had been stealing on top of all of it. I found the shell company, Whitmore Consulting LLC, registered in Delaware, with Derek as the sole officer. He'd been smart about it, keeping the amounts just small enough to avoid triggering audits, coding them as legitimate expenses. But he'd gotten greedy in the last year, probably feeling the pressure as the restaurants struggled. The last 6 months showed withdrawals of $50,000, $75,000, $90,000. He was accelerating, and he was getting sloppy. I didn't confront him. I didn't need to. I just collected. Screenshots, bank records, emails I'd recovered from his laptop before he'd moved out completely. I kept everything in a cloud folder labeled tax documents, because nobody ever looks in the tax documents. By November, I had enough to destroy him, to destroy both of them. But destruction wasn't the plan. The plan was something else. I called my lawyer first, Sarah Chen, who'd represented me in a contract dispute years ago and remembered me as the chef who read the fine print. I need a divorce, I told her. Fast, clean, no contest. Grounds? Irreconcilable differences, but I want it finalized before the end of the year. That's ambitious. Is there property? Nothing joint. I kept my accounts separate. He kept his. I paused. But I want a clause. Full disclosure of all assets, all debts, all business interests. Everything. That's standard. I want it enforced. Aggressively. If he hides anything, I want penalties. Severe ones. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Elena, is there something you're not telling me? Several things, but not things that affect the divorce. Just make sure the disclosure is airtight. She agreed. She was expensive and thorough and exactly what I needed. Then I made the second call. The important one. David Park, I said when he answered. It's Elena Voss. Elena. His voice was warm, surprised, careful. David had been my mentor in ways that mattered. He'd taught me not just how to cook, but how to think about food, about business, about the long game. He'd also been the one who'd introduced me to the investors who'd funded my first restaurant, back when I was 26 and thought I knew everything. I need a favor, I said. And then I need an investment. For? A restaurant, in Manhattan. I have a location in mind, but I need capital. Significant capital. And I need it structured in a very specific way. How specific? I told him. I told him about Margaret's debt, about the private equity firm, about the predatory loan that was about to come due. I told him about the shell company, about Derek's theft, about the leverage I had, and I told him about my vision, not just for a restaurant, but for what came after. When I finished, David was quiet for a long time. "You're talking about buying debt," he said finally. "Distressed debt. That's not restauranting, Elena. That's something else. It's both. The restaurant is the goal. The debt is just the path. And the mother-in-law? She made her choices. I'm making mine." Another pause. Then, "Send me the numbers. I'll look at them." I sent them that night. By the end of the week, David had assembled a small consortium, 3 investors who trusted his judgment, who remembered my name from the old days, who were willing to bet on a chef with a grudge and a spreadsheet. We didn't buy the restaurants. That would have been too obvious, too traceable. Instead, we bought the debt. Whitmore Restaurant Group's primary lender was a private equity firm called Meridian Capital, known in the industry for buying distressed debt and either restructuring or liquidating. They'd been patient with Margaret because her brand had value: Instagram followers, media mentions, the appearance of success. But patience had limits. David's consortium approached Meridian in December, just as Margaret was preparing her annual holiday party, her big show of prosperity and family unity. We offered 60 cents on the dollar for the debt, more than Meridian would have gotten in a liquidation, enough to make it attractive. We structured it through 3 shell companies, layers of corporate obscurity that would take months to penetrate. By Christmas, we owned Margaret's debt. She didn't know it yet. She was still planning her party, still posting about gratitude and family, still pretending that everything was fine. I spent Christmas Day alone in my apartment, eating takeout Thai food and watching snow fall on the street below. Derek had called twice. I hadn't answered. Margaret had sent a card, a generic thing with a gold-embossed tree. No personal message, just her signature in her perfect script. I'd thrown it away unopened. On New Year's Eve, I made my move. The notice arrived on January 3rd, delivered by courier to Whitmore's on 5th during the lunch rush. I know because I was there, sitting at the bar in a wig and oversized sunglasses, watching Margaret's face as she opened the envelope. She went pale, then red. Then something worse, a grayish color that suggested the ground was shifting beneath her Italian leather pumps. The notice was simple. Due to multiple covenant violations and missed performance targets, the debt holder was exercising their right to accelerate repayment. Full amount due, $4.2 million. Payment due in 30 days. Failure to pay would result in foreclosure on all collateral, including the 12 restaurant properties and all associated assets. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there in the middle of her restaurant, the letter trembling in her hand, while her staff pretended not to notice, and her customers went on eating their $38 salads. She called Derek. I watched her face as she listened to his excuses, his promises, his panicked explanations. I watched her realize in real time that her son had been stealing from her, that the accounting adjustments he'd been making weren't adjustments at all, that she'd been betrayed by the one person she'd trusted completely. She didn't call me. She wouldn't. In her mind, I was still the gold digger, the waitress, the nothing. She couldn't conceive that I might be the one holding the knife. I waited 3 days. Then I sent an email. "Dear Margaret, I understand you're facing some financial difficulties. I'd like to propose a solution. I'm prepared to purchase Whitmore Restaurant Group outright, including all properties, equipment, and brand assets, for a price that would cover your outstanding obligations and provide a small personal settlement. I'm also prepared to offer you a position as a consultant with a nominal salary, which would allow you to maintain your professional relationships and public standing. I recognize this is unexpected. I'm happy to discuss terms at your convenience. Sincerely, Elena Voss, CEO, Voss Hospitality Group. She called me within the hour. Her voice was different, thinner, higher, stripped of the performance I'd come to expect. She didn't call me dear. She didn't offer backhanded compliments. She just said, "How?" And then, "Why?" "How is business?" I said. "Why is personal, but practical. I need locations. You need an exit. This benefits us both. You planned this. From the beginning. From that dinner. From before that dinner, Margaret. From the moment you decided I was less than you. From the moment you called me a gold digger in front of your family and expected me to break. I was protecting my son. Your son was stealing from you. I was the one who told you that, indirectly. I was the one who gave you the information you needed to see what he really was." I paused, letting the silence work. "I'm not your enemy, Margaret. I never was. You made me one. I'm just better at it than you expected." She was quiet for a long time. I could hear her breathing, shallow and fast, the sound of someone whose world had become unrecognizable. "What about Derek?" she asked finally. "What about him? Will he... Is he part of this?" "No. Derek is not part of anything anymore. Not my life. Not your business. He's facing his own consequences." I'd made sure of that. The divorce was finalized in late December, the disclosure clause forcing him to reveal the shell company, the stolen funds, the fraud. Sarah had been thorough. The IRS had been notified. The Manhattan DA's office had opened a preliminary investigation. Derek wouldn't see prison. White-collar theft rarely did. Not for amounts under $1 million, but he'd spend years in court, years paying restitution, years watching his mother's empire collapse, and knowing he'd helped destroy it. He'd called me once, after the divorce papers were served. His voice had been broken, disbelieving, childish. "How could you do this to me?" "I didn't do anything to you, Derek. You did it to yourself. I just stopped covering for you. You were supposed to love me. I did love you. That's why I let you lie to me for so long. But love has limits. You found mine." He'd hung up. I hadn't heard from him since. Margaret and I met the following week, not at Whitmore's on 5th. That was already being prepared for closure, but at a coffee shop in Midtown, neutral ground. She looked smaller than I remembered, the expensive clothes hanging looser, the diamonds absent from her fingers. She'd sold them, probably. Or pawned them. The details didn't matter. She signed the papers without reading them. I didn't take advantage, I could have. The offer was fair, even generous. I wasn't interested in destroying her financially. I was interested in something else. "I don't understand you," she said as she handed back the pen. "You could have ruined me. You could have taken everything and left me with nothing." "I could have," I agreed. "But that's not who I am. That's who you thought I was. A gold digger. Someone who takes without building. Then who are you?" I thought about that. About the kitchens I'd worked, the stars I'd earned, the life I'd walked away from and the life I was building. About the difference between revenge and justice, between destruction and creation. "I'm a chef, Margaret. I build things. I create. You spent 40 years performing success without understanding what success actually means. I'm going to show you." I kept one location, Whitmore's on 5th, the flagship, the converted bank with its marble columns and vault door. I closed it for 3 months, stripped it down to the bones, rebuilt it from the inside out. Marco came to work for me as sous chef. 2 of Margaret's former line cooks, kids she'd fired for insubordination, who were actually just talented and ambitious, came back as station chefs. Sarah, my lawyer, became a regular, bringing clients who appreciated food that didn't need Instagram filters to taste good. I called the new restaurant Voss. No elevated American comfort, no consultants, no brand partnerships, just food, made by people who cared about it, served in a space that respected both the history of the building and the integrity of the cooking. We earned our first Michelin star 18 months later. The second came 3 years after that. Margaret came to the opening. I hadn't invited her, but she appeared anyway, dressed in something simple and unbranded, her hair going gray, her hands steady as she shook mine. "It's good," she said, looking around at the dining room, at the open kitchen where Marco was plating a dish I'd designed specifically for her, a terrine of seasonal vegetables, geometric and precise, but seasoned properly, made with care, made with respect. "It's not good," I said. "It's honest. That's different." She nodded, something like understanding in her eyes. "I was wrong about you. I know that doesn't matter. I know it's too late. But I was wrong." "It does matter," I said. "Not because I need your approval, but because you needed to say it. For you." She left after that. I heard she moved to Florida, some retirement community where she played bridge and told stories about her restaurant days without mentioning the collapse. I didn't mind. Stories were all any of us had in the end. Derek served 6 months of house arrest for embezzlement. Last I heard, he was working in sales for a kitchen supply company in New Jersey. Sometimes I wondered if he ever thought about me, about us, about the life we might have had if he'd been brave enough to stand up to his mother, honest enough to face his own weaknesses. I stopped wondering eventually. There was too much to do, too much to build. The restaurant thrived. I opened a second location in Brooklyn, then a third in Chicago. I hired people Margaret had fired, promoted people she'd overlooked, built a culture that valued skill over pedigree, passion over performance. I never married again. That wasn't because I was bitter, I wasn't. It was because I'd learned that the best partnerships in kitchens and in life require mutual respect. I'd had that once, with people who understood me. I didn't need to settle for less. Sometimes, late at night, when the last ticket had been fired and the kitchen was clean and the young cooks had gone home, I would sit at the bar with a glass of wine and look at the vault door, the original bank vault. Still there, still imposing, now holding wine instead of money. I'd think about that dinner 3 years ago, about Margaret's hand on mine, cold and heavy with rings, about the word gold digger hanging in the air like smoke. And I'd smile because she'd been wrong about everything. I hadn't married Derek for money. I hadn't taken her restaurant out of greed. I'd done what I did because I was capable of it, because I'd earned the right to be in rooms where people like her performed their power, because I refused to let anyone make me small. The gold wasn't in the bank. The gold was in the work, in the craft, in the refusal to become what others expected. That was the real inheritance, and I'd claimed it for myself.